What I'm about to reveal to you is one of the most disturbing chapters in Roman history, a secret so dark that even ancient historians struggled to document it fully. In the depths of imperial Rome, beneath the marble palaces and grand forums, there existed chambers where unspeakable acts were committed in the name of the gods. Emperor Domitian, the last of the Flavian dynasty, orchestrated a campaign of sexual torture against Christian women that defied all human decency. These weren't simple executions. These were ritualized acts of brutality, where the emperor himself participated, believing that the violation and mutilation of innocent women would bring divine favor from the Roman pants. For centuries, the full extent of these atrocities remained hidden, sanitized by historians who found the truth too horrifying to record. But today, we're going to descend into those underground chambers and uncover exactly what happened. The testimonies of survivors, the archaeological evidence, and the fragments of suppressed historical accounts paint a picture so disturbing that you'll understand why this story was deliberately erased from mainstream history. But before we enter those chambers of horror, we need to understand the man who created them and the twisted religious justification he used for his crimes. Rome, in the year 81 AD, was a city of contradictions. The Colosseum stood as a monument to Roman engineering and brutality, where thousands had already died for public entertainment. The empire stretched from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to Syria, controlling the known world with military precision and ruthless efficiency.
Into this world of power and blood stepped Titus Flavius Domitianus, known to history as Domitian, the third and final emperor of the Flavian dynasty. He was 30 years old when he assumed the purple, a man shaped by paranoia, ambition, and a religious fervor that would prove deadly. Unlike his father Vespasian and his brother Titus, who had been military heroes, Domitian had spent his youth in Rome's shadows, always the younger son, always overlooked, always hungry for recognition. His childhood had been marked by the chaos of civil war, when 4 emperors fought for control of Rome in a single year. He had hidden in the temple of Jupiter when enemy forces searched for him, disguised as a priest of Isis, an experience that left him with a lifelong obsession with religious ritual and divine favor. Ancient historians like Suetonius and Dio Cassius describe a man of contradictions. He was an able administrator who strengthened Rome's borders and reformed the economy. Yet he was also deeply insecure, demanding to be addressed as Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. He sponsored magnificent games and building projects, yet he lived in constant fear of assassination. He could quote poetry and appreciate art, yet he personally designed instruments of torture. The Roman world Domitian inherited was one where Christians represented a growing threat to traditional power structures. These followers of a crucified Jewish preacher refused to offer incense to the emperor's statue, rejected the pantheon of Roman gods, and spoke of a kingdom not of this world. To a man who demanded worship as a living God, this was not merely religious dissent, but personal insult and political treason. The penalty for such defiance, Domitian decided, needed to be severe enough to terrify others into submission. But execution alone was not sufficient. He wanted to break their spirit, defile their faith, and demonstrate that their God could not protect them from Rome's power. The persecution began gradually in the mid-80s AD, initially targeting Christian leaders and prominent converts from noble families. But by 89 AD, After crushing a military rebellion led by Antonius Saturninus, Domitian's paranoia transformed into something far more sinister. He began to see conspiracies everywhere, and Christians, with their secret meetings and refusal to worship him, became convenient scapegoats. The emperor issued private orders to his Praetorian Guard and to governors throughout the empire. Christian women were to be arrested and brought to Rome for special treatment. Not the quick death of the arena, not simple beheading or crucifixion, but something designed to destroy them spiritually before destroying them physically. Historical accounts from Eusebius and later Christian writers, drawing on now lost sources, describe the establishment of special chambers beneath the imperial palace complex on the Palatine Hill. These weren't the public execution grounds where criminals died before cheering crowds. These were private spaces, accessible only to the emperor and his selected associates, where the screams of victims would echo off stone walls that no outsider would ever see. Archaeological excavations in the 19th and 20th centuries beneath the Palatine have revealed complex networks of underground rooms that match these descriptions. Chambers with iron rings embedded in walls, drainage systems designed to wash away blood and other fluids, and acoustics that would contain sound. While archaeologists officially classify these as storage areas or slave quarters, some researchers have noted features consistent with their use as torture chambers. The selection of victims followed a calculated pattern. Domitian specifically targeted young Christian women from respectable families, particularly virgins who had consecrated themselves to their faith. In Christian theology, virginity held sacred significance, representing spiritual purity and dedication to Christ. Domitian understood this perfectly. By defiling these women sexually before killing them, he sought to attack not just their bodies, but the very foundation of their religious identity. He wanted to prove that their God was powerless to protect even the most devoted followers. The process began with arrests conducted in the dead of night. Praetorian guardsmen, acting on lists compiled by informers, would surround Christian meeting houses or break into private homes. Families were given no explanation, no trial, no opportunity for defense. The women were simply taken, shackled, and transported to the capital if they weren't already there. Surviving testimony fragments preserved in martyrologies describe the terror of these abductions. Mothers torn from children, young women dragged from their beds, entire female congregations arrested during prayer meetings. They were brought first to holding cells beneath the palace, dark chambers where they would wait for days or weeks, hearing the screams of those who had gone before them, knowing their own turn would come. During this waiting period, they were subjected to preliminary tortures designed to break their will. Starvation, sleep deprivation, beatings, and psychological torture. Guards would describe in graphic detail what awaited them, offering them a simple choice: renounce Christ, offer incense to Domitian's statue, and go free. Or refuse, and face what awaited in the deeper chambers. The historical record, fragmentary though it is, indicates that most refused. Their faith, paradoxically, became the source of their suffering. The emperor himself maintained a schedule of visits to these underground chambers. According to Suetonius, who had access to palace records, Domitian would descend to the torture room several times each week, timing his visits to coincide with the interrogation and violation of new victims. He did not merely observe. He participated actively, personally directing the torturers, suggesting new methods, and engaging in sexual assault himself. This wasn't the action of a man overcome by sudden passion or rage. This was ritualized, methodical, and infused with religious significance in Domitian's twisted mind. He believed
based on his interpretation of ancient Roman religious practices and possibly influenced by mystery cults he had studied, that the sexual violation of virgin enemies consecrated to a foreign god would transfer their spiritual power to him and please the traditional Roman deities he claimed to serve. The specific tortures inflicted on these women combined sexual violence with brutal physical mutilation. Historical sources, though often using euphemistic language, describe procedures that modern readers will find deeply disturbing. Women were stripped naked and displayed before groups of palace officials and guards, intentionally humiliating them before the physical torture began. They were then subjected to rape, not by a single attacker, but systematically by multiple men, sometimes continuing for hours or even days. The emperor maintained a cadre of individuals specifically for this purpose, men selected for their brutality and their willingness to participate in acts that shocked even Rome's hardened soldiers. But the sexual violence was only the beginning. Domitian had commissioned the creation of specialized torture instruments, some adapted from existing Roman practices, others apparently designed specifically for these religious persecutions. One device described in martyrological accounts was a bronze implement, heated in coals until it glowed red, shaped to be inserted into women's bodies, causing internal burns that would be both agonizing and eventually fatal. Another was a table with restraints that would spread women's limbs to unnatural angles, while sharp implements were used to mutilate their breasts and genitals. The purpose was not quick death, but prolonged suffering, maximum physical pain combined with maximum psychological humiliation. Throughout these tortures, the victims were repeatedly asked to renounce their faith. Each refusal brought escalated brutality. Historical accounts speak of Christian women praying aloud even as they were violated, singing hymns as they were mutilated, calling on Christ to receive their spirits as they died. These responses, rather than moving their torturers to mercy, seemed to enrage Domitian further. He saw their endurance not as remarkable courage, but as defiance that required even more extreme measures to break. Some victims, according to Christian sources, were kept alive for weeks, subjected to repeated sessions of torture and rape, their wounds treated just enough to keep them conscious for the next round of abuse. The bodies of those who finally died in the chambers were not returned to families for proper burial. Instead, they were disposed of secretly, likely thrown into the Tiber River at night or buried in unmarked pits beyond the city walls, deliberately denying them the funeral rites that both Roman and Christian tradition considered essential for the soul's peace. The scale of this persecution is difficult to establish with precision. Ancient sources disagree on numbers, with Christian martyrologies claiming hundreds of women suffered this fate during Domitian's reign, while pagan historians either remain silent or suggest smaller numbers. The truth likely lies somewhere between these extremes. What is clear is that the persecution was systematic, sustained over several years, and involved substantial resources and planning. The emperor dedicated significant time and attention to these activities, suggesting they held importance beyond mere sadistic pleasure. He genuinely believed he was performing a religious duty, cleansing Rome of foreign contamination and demonstrating the superiority of Roman gods over the Christian deity. In Domitian's worldview, shaped by absolute power and paranoid religiosity, these women were not innocent victims, but dangerous enemies whose very existence threatened the cosmic order he claimed to protect.
One particularly well-documented case, preserved in multiple Christian sources, involves a young woman named Flavia Domitilla, who may have been the emperor's own niece or cousin. She had converted to Christianity and taken a vow of virginity, dedicating herself to charitable works among Rome's poor. When Domitian discovered her conversion, he reportedly flew into a rage, seeing her choice as both personal betrayal and public humiliation. Rather than executing her quietly, he determined to make her an example. According to the account, Domitilla was brought to the underground chambers and subjected to particularly prolonged torture. She was offered repeatedly the chance to save herself through simple apostasy, an offer she consistently refused. The historical account describes her being raped by multiple men while Domitian watched and mocked her faith, asking where her God was now. When she continued to pray aloud, he had her tongue cut out. When she continued to mouth prayers, he had her violated with heated instruments. Finally, after days of torture that left her body destroyed, she was strangled and her corpse disposed of in secret. The story of Domitilla, whether entirely accurate in details or somewhat legendary, represents the pattern that repeated with variations for numerous women during this period. The emperor's actions did not go entirely unchallenged, even within his own palace. Some advisors and officials, though not Christian themselves, found the sexual nature of these tortures excessive, even by Rome's brutal standards. Traditional Roman execution methods included crucifixion, burning, and wild animals in the arena, all publicly visible and designed to deter crime while entertaining the masses. But systematic rape and sexual mutilation conducted in secret chambers struck some Romans as dishonorable, unworthy of Roman dignity, and potentially offensive to the very gods Domitian claimed to serve. These concerns were expressed cautiously and privately, as open criticism of the emperor had become extremely dangerous. Domitian's reign was characterized by increasing paranoia and an extensive network of informers. Even senators were executed on the slightest suspicion of disloyalty. If he could torture his own relatives for religious dissent, no one was safe from his wrath. The result was a palace atmosphere of fear, where most officials simply looked away, pretending ignorance of what happened in the chambers below, while privately hoping that the emperor's madness would eventually consume itself. The broader Roman public remained largely ignorant of the specific nature of these persecutions. They knew that Christians were being punished, which most Romans supported or at least accepted. Christianity was still seen as a strange and antisocial sect that refused to participate in civic religious duties. Public executions of Christians in the arena were attended enthusiastically, but the private, sexual tortures in the palace chambers were never announced or acknowledged. They remained the emperor's secret, shared only with those directly involved and the Christian community, where stories circulated in whispers among the faithful, both terrifying them and strengthening their resolve to remain loyal to their faith, even unto death. Within Christian communities, the response to these persecutions was complex. Certainly there was terror. Many Christians went into hiding, fled to distant provinces, or practiced their faith in extreme secrecy. Some, faced with the reality of what arrest meant, especially for women, did apostatize, offering incense to the emperor's statue to save themselves and their families. These lapsi, as they were later called, would create theological controversies in the early church about whether such apostasy could ever be forgiven. But there was also profound spiritual resistance. Christian leaders preached that martyrdom was the highest form of witness, that those who endured suffering for Christ would receive eternal glory, and that earthly pain was temporary compared to heavenly reward. Women facing possible arrest were counseled to prepare mentally and spiritually for torture and death, to see themselves as brides of Christ, entering into ultimate union with him through suffering.
This theology of martyrdom, born partly from necessity in the face of Roman persecution, would become a fundamental aspect of early Christian identity. The stories of women who endured Domitian's tortures without renouncing their faith became sacred narratives, told and retold in Christian gatherings, written down in martyrologies, and celebrated as examples of ultimate faithfulness.
These accounts, while often containing legendary elaborations, preserve the core memory of real women who suffered real horrors. They also served a practical purpose, preparing the next generation of Christians for the possibility that they too might face similar trials, giving them models of courage to emulate. The fact that specifically women, and specifically virgin women, featured so prominently in these martyrdom accounts reflects both the historical reality that Domitian targeted them and the theological significance early Christians attached to consecrated virginity as a form of spiritual resistance to Roman sexual and political domination. As Domitian's reign progressed into the 90s AD, his behavior became increasingly erratic and paranoid. The underground chambers continued to operate, but his focus expanded to include perceived political enemies beyond the Christian community. Senators, military commanders, even members of his own family faced execution on flimsy charges of conspiracy. The emperor's tyrannical behavior created widespread resentment among Rome's elite, who began to see him not as a strong leader, but as a dangerous madman who threatened everyone. Behind the scenes, a conspiracy formed, involving palace officials, praetorian officers, and members of the imperial household who had grown to hate and fear Domitian. The final conspiracy involved individuals who had direct knowledge of what happened in the torture chambers. Some may have participated reluctantly and harbored guilt or disgust. Others had seen family members or people they cared about disappear into those chambers. The decision to assassinate Domitian was driven by multiple motives, but the emperor's cruelty, exemplified most clearly in his treatment of Christian women, had created an atmosphere where even those closest to him wanted him dead. On September 18th, 96 AD, the conspiracy came to fruition. Domitian was lured into a private room in his palace by a trusted freedman named Stephanus, who had concealed a dagger in a bandaged arm. When Stephanus revealed the blade, Domitian fought back desperately, and the assassination turned into a brutal struggle. Other conspirators rushed in, and together they stabbed the emperor multiple times. Domitian died on the floor of his own palace, the same building beneath which he had tortured so many others. He was 44 years old and had ruled for 15 years. The Roman Senate, which had lived in terror of Domitian, reacted to his death with barely concealed joy. They immediately voted for damnatio memoriae, the official condemnation of his memory. His statues were torn down, his name was chiseled off public inscriptions, and his image was removed from coins. The Senate wanted to erase him from history as thoroughly as possible. In the immediate aftermath of Domitian's death, the new emperor Nerva, a respected elderly senator, took steps to distance himself from his predecessor's cruelty. He released political prisoners, recalled exiles, and publicly declared an end to religious persecutions. Christian sources suggest that he also ordered the underground torture chambers sealed and cleaned, though likely this was motivated more by a desire to eliminate evidence of imperial crimes than by concern for past victims. The bodies of countless women remained unrecovered. Their families never learned their fates, and the specific details of what happened in those chambers were deliberately obscured. Nerva's brief reign and that of his successor Trajan saw a shift in official policy toward Christians. While Christianity remained illegal and Christians could still be executed if formally accused and convicted, the systematic hunting and torturing of believers ended. Trajan's famous rescript to Pliny the Younger established that Christians should not be sought out, and anonymous accusations should be ignored. This didn't end persecution entirely,
but it ended the kind of state-sponsored sexual torture that Domitian had practiced. The chambers themselves were eventually built over, as successive emperors modified the palace complex, burying the physical evidence beneath new construction. For Christian communities, the end of Domitian's persecution brought relief, but also a complex legacy. The martyrs of his reign became venerated figures, their stories preserved in growing collections of martyrological literature. Writers like Eusebius in the 4th century, working from sources now lost to us, documented these persecutions and ensured that future generations of Christians would remember what their ancestors had endured. But the accounts were often sanitized or made more spiritual, focusing on the martyrs' courage and faith while minimizing the graphic sexual nature of their torture. Perhaps because these details were considered too shameful or disturbing to record fully. Modern historical scholarship has struggled with this legacy.
Secular historians, working primarily from pagan sources like Suetonius and Dio Cassius, have often treated Christian martyrdom accounts with skepticism, viewing them as legendary exaggerations designed to glorify the early church. And certainly, martyrologies do contain legendary elements, miraculous interventions, and theological interpretations that complicate historical analysis. But the archaeological evidence, the references in multiple independent sources, and the patterns consistent across accounts suggest that the core claims about Domitian's persecution, including the sexual torture of Christian women, have a substantial historical basis. The specific details may be impossible to verify completely, but the overall picture of systematic state violence targeting Christian women through sexual brutality appears to be historically sound. What makes this history particularly dark is not just the physical brutality, which was sadly common in the ancient world, but the calculated combination of sexual violence with religious persecution. Domitian understood that for Christian women who had dedicated their virginity to God, sexual violation represented not just physical assault, but spiritual destruction. He weaponized rape and sexual mutilation specifically to attack their faith, to make them feel abandoned by their God, to destroy their sense of sacred identity. This was not passion, or even simple cruelty, but systematic psychological and spiritual warfare waged through the medium of sexual violence. It represents one of the earliest documented cases of rape being used deliberately and systematically as a tool of religious persecution and political control. The long-term impact on early Christianity was profound. The experience of persecution, particularly the sexual persecution of women under Domitian, shaped Christian theology and practice in several ways. First, it elevated the status of martyrdom to the highest form of Christian witness, creating a culture that saw suffering for faith as a path to holiness. Second, it reinforced Christian sexual ethics that valued celibacy and virginity as forms of spiritual resistance to Roman imperial culture, which Romans practiced rather casually about sexuality. Third, it created a deep suspicion of state power and a theological framework for understanding the church as inherently separate from, and often opposed to, earthly kingdoms. These themes would persist throughout Christian history, influencing everything from monastic movements to medieval conflicts between church and state. The question naturally arises, how could human beings engage in such systematic cruelty? How could Domitian personally participate in the rape and torture of women and sleep peacefully afterward? How could palace officials, guards, and torturers carry out these orders day after day? The answer lies partly in the nature of absolute power and the dehumanization of victims. Domitian had been raised from childhood to believe that he was destined to be a god, that his will was law,
that entire populations existed to serve his purposes. In such a worldview, the suffering of individuals who defied him had no moral weight. They were enemies of the state and of the gods, deserving of punishment, and their pain was religiously justified. For the men who carried out the actual tortures, various psychological mechanisms allowed participation. Some genuinely shared the emperor's religious ideology and saw themselves as performing sacred duty. Others were following orders in a system where disobedience meant their own death. Some may have been individuals whose psychological makeup allowed or even enjoyed inflicting suffering, who had found in imperial service an outlet for sadistic impulses. And many likely experienced psychological dissociation, treating the work as simply a job, compartmentalizing the horror to maintain their own sanity. This is a pattern we see repeated throughout history whenever systematic atrocity occurs. A combination of ideology, obedience to authority, individual pathology, and psychological defense mechanisms that allow ordinary people to participate in extraordinary evil. Comparing Domitian's persecution to other historical atrocities reveals disturbing patterns. The use of sexual violence as a weapon of terror and control appears across centuries and cultures. The Spanish Inquisition tortured suspected heretics, often with sexual components. Colonial powers systematically raped indigenous women as a tool of conquest and cultural destruction. Modern genocides in Bosnia, Rwanda, and Myanmar have featured systematic sexual violence targeting specific ethnic or religious groups of women. The Nazis used sexual humiliation and violence in concentration camps. Domitian's underground chambers find echoes in secret police torture facilities in dozens of 20th century dictatorships. The specific methods change, but the underlying logic remains constant. Sexual violence can destroy victims physically, psychologically, and spiritually, while demonstrating the complete power of the perpetrator and the helplessness of the victim's community to protect them. What makes these parallels particularly disturbing is the religious justification consistently offered for such violence. Domitian claimed divine sanction for his actions, portraying torture as religious ritual pleasing to the gods. Medieval inquisitors tortured in the name of Christian orthodoxy. Modern extremist groups from various religious traditions have justified sexual violence against women of other faiths as divinely approved. This suggests something deeply troubling about the intersection of absolute religious certainty, political power, and the human capacity for cruelty. When individuals or regimes believe they act with divine authority, normal moral restraints can dissolve, and any atrocity can be rationalized as serving a higher purpose. For the victims and their communities, the trauma extended far beyond the individuals directly tortured. Families lost daughters, mothers, sisters. Communities lost leaders and members. Survivors carried physical and psychological wounds for the rest of their lives. The fear of arrest and torture shaped Christian behavior and practices for generations. And the memory of what happened, passed down through martyrological accounts, created a collective trauma within early Christianity that influenced the faith's development in ways both positive and negative. Positively, it fostered deep compassion for suffering, elevation of the oppressed, and courage in the face of persecution. Negatively, it sometimes encouraged a problematic glorification of suffering itself and created suspicion and hostility toward civil authorities that occasionally became excessive. In examining this history, we must resist two temptations.
The first is to dismiss martyrological accounts entirely as legend and propaganda. While these sources certainly contain legendary elements in theological interpretation, the weight of evidence suggests that something like what they describe actually happened. Real women really suffered and died in those underground chambers. Their stories deserve to be remembered and honored, not dismissed as fiction. The second temptation is to use this history to attack religion generally, or Roman civilization specifically, as uniquely evil. The truth is that systematic cruelty, including sexual violence as a tool of oppression, appears across virtually all human cultures and time periods when conditions of absolute power, dehumanization of others, and ideological justification combine.
The lessons of Domitian's persecution are universal, not particular to ancient Rome or to conflicts between paganism and Christianity. The historical record of Domitian's persecution was nearly lost entirely. His memory was officially condemned, creating official silence about his reign. Christian martyrological accounts were transmitted orally for generations before being written down, during which time they acquired legendary elements that made them easier for later scholars to dismiss. The physical spaces where the tortures occurred were buried beneath later construction and forgotten. For centuries, the story existed primarily in Christian tradition, told in churches and monasteries but not considered reliable by secular historians. The rediscovery and rehabilitation of this history has been gradual.
Archaeological work in the 19th and 20th centuries began revealing the underground complexes beneath the Palatine Hill. More careful analysis of ancient sources, both pagan and Christian, has allowed historians to cross-reference accounts and identify likely historical kernels within legendary accretions. Modern understanding of trauma and systematic violence has provided frameworks for understanding how such atrocities could occur and be documented. The result is a more complex and credible picture of early Christian persecution, including the specifically sexual nature of violence against women, than was available to scholars even a generation ago. Yet, significant gaps remain. We don't know the names of most victims. We can't verify specific details of torture methods described in martyrologies. We can't quantify precisely how many women suffered and died.
The historical record is fragmentary, biased, and incomplete. What we can say with confidence is that during the reign of Emperor Domitian, systematic sexual torture of Christian women occurred in underground chambers in Rome. That the emperor personally participated in these tortures, believing they served religious purposes, and that this persecution left a lasting impact on early Christianity and represents one of the darker chapters in the history of religious persecution. The legacy of these events extends to modern times in several ways. For Christian communities, particularly Catholic and Orthodox traditions that venerate martyrs, the women who died under Domitian's persecution are remembered as saints, whose courage and faith inspire believers today. Their feast days are celebrated. Their stories are told. Their intercession is sought.
This living memory keeps the history alive in a way that purely academic historical study cannot. For scholars of religious persecution, Domitian's reign provides a case study in how state power weaponizes sexual violence against religious minorities. The patterns visible in first-century Rome recur throughout history whenever governments seek to destroy religious communities through terror. Understanding these patterns helps identify and hopefully prevent such persecution today. For feminists and scholars of violence against women, this history illustrates how sexual violence has consistently been used as a tool of political and religious oppression, specifically targeting women. The fact that Domitian specifically selected virgin women,
that the torture was designed to defile them sexually before killing them, demonstrates how patriarchal power structures use rape and sexual violence not just as individual acts, but as systematic weapons of control and terror. For human rights advocates, the underground chambers where victims were tortured in secret, denied trials or public accountability, represent an early example of the secret detention and torture that continues in authoritarian regimes today. The patterns established in Domitian's palace recur in modern police states. Secret arrest, torture to extract confessions or force apostasy, disposal of bodies without accountability, official denial of what everyone knows is happening. The parallels are uncomfortable but undeniable. What can we learn from this dark chapter of history?
First, that absolute power, combined with religious fanaticism, creates conditions for extraordinary cruelty. Domitian's belief in his own divinity and his conviction that he served the gods by torturing Christians removed all moral restraints on his behavior. This pattern repeats whenever leaders claim divine sanction for their actions and face no accountability. Second, that sexual violence is not primarily about sexuality, but about power, control, and the desire to destroy victims not just physically, but spiritually and psychologically. Domitian understood that violating Christian women sexually would damage them in ways that simple execution would not. This weaponization of sexual violence remains a tool of oppressors worldwide. Third, that documentation and memory matter profoundly. If early Christians had not preserved the stories of these martyrs, however imperfectly, this history would have been completely lost. The impulse to bear witness to suffering, to name the victims, to record what happened even when it's almost too painful to speak about, serves crucial functions both for processing trauma and for preventing future atrocities through historical knowledge. Fourth, that human beings possess both remarkable capacity for cruelty and remarkable capacity for courage. The men who tortured and killed women in those chambers, the emperor who designed and participated in these tortures, were human beings like us, not monsters from another species. And the women who endured these horrors while maintaining their faith and dignity were also human beings like us, not supernatural heroes. Both extremes exist within human nature and human possibility. As we conclude this examination of one of history's darkest episodes, several questions remain worth pondering. How do we remember victims of historical atrocities when the historical record is incomplete and contested? How do we honor their suffering without glorifying suffering itself? How do we learn from past persecutions to prevent current and future ones? How do we grapple with the reality that the same religious faith that inspired victims to endure torture has also, in other contexts and times, inspired perpetrators to inflict it? These are not simple questions with easy answers, but they are necessary questions if we are to engage with history honestly. The underground chambers beneath the Palatine Hill are now buried under centuries of construction, likely never to be fully excavated. The bodies of the women tortured there were never recovered. Their names, except for a few like Flavia Domitilla, are lost to history, but their stories, preserved in fragments and tradition, continue to speak across the centuries. They testify to the human cost of tyranny, the specific vulnerability of women
to sexualized violence in contexts of persecution, and the courage that ordinary people can summon when facing extraordinary evil. In our own time, when religious persecution continues in many parts of the world, when sexual violence remains a weapon of war and oppression, when authoritarian leaders still claim divine sanction for cruelty, these ancient stories remain disturbingly relevant. The specific circumstances change, but the underlying dynamics of power, violence, and faith remain constant.
By remembering what happened in those chambers under Domitian's palace, by refusing to forget the women who suffered there, by examining honestly both the cruelty humans can inflict and the courage humans can embody, we honor their memory, and perhaps make it slightly less likely that such horrors will recur unchallenged. The darkness of this history is profound, but so is the light of remembrance and the determination to say, never again. That determination, kept alive across 2 millennia, is perhaps the true legacy of the women who died in those underground chambers, faithful unto death.